Your daughter is quite the negotiator. She would never do this to me.
He negotiated for a living. Leases, loans, lives. But the one deal Kang Yeon-woo never saw coming was the one his own daughter would make behind his back. With the woman who'd hunted him for 9 years, he negotiated for a living. Leases, loans, lives. But the one deal Kang Yeon-woo never saw coming was the one his own daughter would make behind his back, with the woman who'd hunted him for 9 years. The first thing you should know about Kang Yeon-woo is that he never once raised his voice in 22 years of running an empire built on fear. Not once. He didn't need to. Men who scream are men who've run out of leverage, and Kang always had leverage. On the loan shark who once threatened his father's fish stall, on the customs officer who forgot to inspect a container, on the detective who spent nearly a decade chasing a ghost with excellent tailoring and a soft spot for Brahms. If you'd passed him on the street in his beige cardigan, reading glasses perched low on his nose, you'd have pegged him for an actuary, maybe a mild-mannered pharmacist who overcharges for cough syrup but tips well at restaurants. That was the point. Monsters who look like monsters get arrested in year 1. Monsters who look like your accountant get invited to your daughter's wedding. This is the story of how that particular monster built an empire out of mackerel, misery, and meticulous paperwork, and how it came apart, not because of a rival gang with better guns, but because of 2 women who never stopped asking questions he'd spent his whole life training people not to ask. Let's rewind. Busan, 1994. Jigaoki Fish Market at 4 in the morning smells like the ocean had a nervous breakdown and nobody cleaned it up. Steam curls off crates of mackerel. Vendors scream prices like it's a hostage negotiation. And there, 16 years old, sleeves rolled up, eyes doing math faster than his mouth could keep up, was Kang Yeon-woo, a fish stall kid who was about to learn the only lesson that would define the rest of his life. His father's stall was drowning in debt. Loan sharks circled it the way actual sharks circle actual chum. Patient, unbothered, certain of the outcome. They came one morning to collect, or to take the stall as compensation, which is a polite word criminals use for theft when they want it to sound like paperwork. Most 16-year-olds would have cried. Kang negotiated. He offered the loan sharks crew something better than a fish stall, a route. A quiet, chaotic, barely regulated shipping corridor through the market that nobody in law enforcement had the patience to untangle. The loan shark laughed at the kid's audacity. Then he stopped laughing, because the kid was right, and the kid made him money. That was the moment. Not a montage, not a slow-motion walk away from an explosion, just a teenage boy realizing that chaos isn't a problem you solve. Chaos is a business opportunity that hasn't been introduced to the right accountant yet. By his 30s, Kang had turned a fish stall bloodline into something that moved far more than mackerel. Counterfeit goods, laundered cash, consulting services so deliberately vague that even his own bookkeepers needed a minute and possibly a stiff drink to process the invoices. He refused to give the organization a name. No name, he liked to say. Sipping tea with the calm of a man who'd never once lost an argument means no evidence. Try subpoenaing a rumor. His loyalty, when he gave it, came with strings attached so fine you didn't feel them until they'd already tightened around your throat. His enforcer, a fiercely devoted young man named Han Ji-tae, learned this the hard way, though it would take him a decade to admit it, even to himself. Kang had quietly paid off Ji-tae's mother's hospital bills when the boy was 19, no explanation, no request for thanks. Ji-tae saw it as salvation. Kang saw it as an investment. Cheap, renewable, grateful. For 10 years, that arrangement held. Ji-tae became Kang's shadow, silent, efficient, terrifyingly good at making problems disappear without a trace, or occasionally, without a body attached to the trace at all. But shadows have a strange habit of noticing things the light doesn't want them to see. And somewhere across the city, a detective named Osei Jean was about to become the second woman in this story who refused to stop asking questions. The first being a daughter Kang thought he'd successfully kept in the dark for 20 years. He was wrong about that, too. He just didn't know it yet. Detective Osei Jean did not look like a woman who was about to spend 9 years of her life chasing a man who smelled like Earl Grey and quiet menace. She looked, if anything, tired. The specific tired that comes from being the only person in a room who believes the spreadsheet is more honest than the witness. Her colleagues called her obsessive. Her superiors called her a liability with a badge. She called it Tuesday, and then she went back to work because somebody had to. She joined the Financial Crimes Unit 11 years earlier with the naive assumption that criminals hid money the way people hide snacks from their diet, badly, guiltily, in obvious places. Kang Yeon-woo disabused her of that notion within her first year on his trail. His shell companies didn't hide. They performed legitimacy, the way a magician performs a card trick, in plain sight, with just enough misdirection that you clapped instead of asking how it was done. It started, as these things always do, with something small and boring. A shipping manifest from a Busan export company listing assorted seafood products, bound for Jakarta, valued at an amount that made no arithmetic sense whatsoever, unless, say Jean realized at 2 in the morning over her 4th cup of instant coffee. The crates weren't full of fish at all. They were full of something that needed fish as a chaperone. She flagged it. Her supervisor told her to focus on cases with actual leads. She flagged 3 more. Same company, different names, same suspiciously poetic invoicing, assorted goods, miscellaneous cargo, language so deliberately vague it might as well have said trust us. Somewhere in year 3 of chasing paperwork that led nowhere and everywhere at once, say Jean started keeping a private file at home, the kind of file detectives in movies keep on corkboards with red string. Except hers was a spreadsheet, because red string doesn't have a sort by column function. By year 6, she had a name. Kang Yeon-woo. A quiet import broker with a spotless public record, 3 charitable donations a year, and a habit of paying for his employees' mother's hospital bills that looked, on paper, disturbingly like kindness. It took her another 18 months to understand it wasn't kindness at all. It was architecture. Every debt Kang paid was a wall he was building around himself, brick by grateful brick, and the bricks didn't know they were bricks. They thought they were family. He doesn't recruit soldiers, she told her partner one night, staring at a wall of photographs that her captain kept threatening to make her take down. He recruits debts. People who owe him something they can never fully repay. That's smarter than any gun. Her partner, a pragmatic man who preferred cases that ended in handcuffs within a fiscal quarter, just sighed and asked if she'd slept at all that week. She hadn't. She wouldn't. Not really, for another 3 years. Meanwhile, for 1,000 miles removed from all of it in the geography that mattered, and precisely 0 miles removed in the geography of consequence, a 19-year-old girl named Kang Soo-min was sitting in a boarding school dormitory in Switzerland, opening a birthday card from a father she saw twice a year, if that. The card had money in it. It always had money in it. It never had anything else. No funny story. No I miss you. No evidence that the man writing it had ever once considered what it might feel like to be a daughter raised entirely by absence. Soo-min didn't hate her father. That would have required knowing him well enough to hate him properly. What she felt was stranger and quieter, a low, persistent hum of why, the kind of question that doesn't scream, just waits. Why the money and never the man? Why the silence every time she asked, as a child, what exactly import consulting meant? Why her classmates' parents came to graduation and hers sent a card with money in it, and a signature that looked like it had been practiced. She was, without knowing it yet, about to come home to Korea for university and start asking the very questions her father had spent 2 decades ensuring she'd never need to ask. 2 women, thousands of miles apart, both circling the same quiet man for entirely different reasons. One with a spreadsheet, one with a birthday card full of unanswered questions. Kang Yeon-woo sipped his tea in Busan, utterly unaware that the walls he'd built so carefully were about to be tested from 2 directions at once, by 2 women who had one thing devastatingly in common. Neither of them was willing to stop asking why. Han Ji-tae had a scar on his left palm from the night he proved his loyalty to Kang Yeon-woo, and for 10 years he'd worn it like a medal. It happened during a dispute with a rival broker who thought Kang's fish market corridor was ripe for a hostile takeover. Ji-tae had ended the dispute with his bare hands and a broken bottle, and Kang had looked at the aftermath with the mild interest of a man reviewing a slightly disappointing lunch order, then said 4 words that Ji-tae had built the rest of his adult life around. "You'll go far, son." Not thank you. Not well done, son. A word so precisely chosen it should have come with a receipt, because that's exactly what it was, a down payment on a decade of unquestioning service. Ji-tae ran the muscle side of the operation the way a good sommelier runs a wine list, with restraint, with taste, with an instinct for knowing exactly how much force a situation actually required and stopping precisely there. He wasn't cruel for pleasure. He was cruel for efficiency, which somehow made him more frightening to the men who worked under him, not less. Cruelty for pleasure is at least predictable. Cruelty for efficiency adapts. He believed, for 10 years, that he was building something alongside Kang, not beneath him, alongside him. That belief survived several inconvenient realities. The fact that Kang never once invited him past the front hallway of his actual home. The fact that every we, in Kang's vocabulary somehow resolved, on closer inspection, into a very precise I. The fact that when a courier was caught skimming shipments and quietly disappeared, Kang's only comment afterward was, renewable resource. There's always another courier. Ji-tae had laughed at that, back then. It's remarkable, in hindsight, how long a person can laugh at a sentence that was actually a warning. The cracks started small, the way cracks do. A shipment route Ji-tae had spent 8 months developing got handed to someone else without explanation. A meeting he should have been in got moved to a time he happened to be unavailable. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's betrayal. Just a slow recalibration of his position in Kang's world, from architecture to furniture. Useful, load-bearing even, but ultimately replaceable if the room needed redecorating. He mentioned it once, carefully, over soju, framing it as a joke, because that's the only way men like Ji-tae are allowed to express hurt. Feels like I'm becoming furniture, boss. Kang had smiled. That thin, pleasant smile he gave everyone, the one that never once reached the rest of his face, and said, everyone's furniture to somebody, Ji-tae. The trick is being furniture nobody wants to throw out. He'd meant it as reassurance. Ji-tae heard it as a sentence with a very quiet expiration date attached. Across the city, Detective Osei Jean had finally caught a break that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with 9 years of refusing to stop reading spreadsheets nobody else wanted to look at. A pharmaceutical shipment, counterfeit medication disguised as legitimate imports, worth an amount of money that made even her jaded captain sit up straight for once, traced back through 4 shell companies to a warehouse on Busan's waterfront. Same corridor, same quietly poetic invoicing, same ghost she'd been chasing since her hair still had color in it she didn't pay for. This was the shipment that could bury Kang Yeon-woo. Real evidence, real quantities, real names attached to real accounts, not just suspicious vibes and a decade of instinct. She stood in front of her unit, laid it all out, and for the first time in 9 years, nobody in the room called it an obsession. We move in 6 days, her captain said. Quietly. If he so much as smells this, it's gone. Sejin nodded, already calculating who inside her own department might not be as trustworthy as their badge suggested. Because a man like Kang didn't survive 20 years without ears in rooms he was never physically in. She'd learned, the hard way, 3 years earlier, that quietly and safely were 2 very different promises, and Kang Yeon-woo had a talent for making one sound like the other. 6 days. That was the timeline. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that 6 days was also, almost to the hour, how long it would take a 19-year-old girl named Kang Soo-min to land back in Korea for the first time in 3 years, walk into her father's house uninvited, and start asking the exact questions he'd spent 2 decades making sure she'd never think to ask. Some clocks run on evidence. Some run on love that finally curdled into curiosity. Kang Yeon-woo, sipping his tea, had no idea both of them had just started ticking at once. The house Kang Yeon-woo built for himself outside Busan was the kind of place that photographed like tranquility and functioned like a fortress. Clean lines, minimalist furniture, a koi pond he'd once described, without irony, as good for negotiations, bad for enemies. When Soo-min walked through the front gate for the first time in 3 years, unannounced, dragging 1 suitcase and 2 decades of unanswered questions, the housekeeper nearly dropped a tea tray. Kang was in his study when he heard her voice in the hallway. That same voice, older now, no longer asking for permission to speak. He stood, straightened his cardigan out of habit rather than vanity, and opened the door with the calm of a man who genuinely believed there was no version of this conversation he couldn't manage. He was wrong within the first 90 seconds. I met a man at university, Soo-min said, not bothering with a greeting, who told me his cousin worked the docks and lost 2 fingers to a machine your company never reported to safety inspectors. He didn't know I was your daughter. I let him keep talking. She let that sit in the room like smoke. So, import consulting. Want to try that explanation again, Dad? Or should I keep collecting stories from strangers who don't know who I am? Kang did what he always did under pressure. He reached for a metaphor, the way other men reach for a drink. Every industry has friction. Soo-min: fishing, shipping, banking. You think Samsung's supply chain is clean? The world runs on friction. I simply learned to profit from it instead of pretending it doesn't exist. It was, by his own internal standards, a rather elegant deflection. It landed on his daughter like a wet napkin. That's not an answer. That's a TED Talk for people who already agree with you. Here's the thing about Kang Yeon-woo that even his enemies grudgingly respected. He never lied to people who'd already caught him. He considered it inefficient, almost rude, like continuing to bluff after someone's flipped over your cards. So instead, for the first time in his daughter's entire adult life, he told her something close to the truth. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough. The fish stall. The loan sharks. The moment at 16 when he decided the world only respected people who stopped asking for permission and started collecting debts instead. Soo-min listened, arms crossed, jaw tight, and when he finished, she didn't cry, didn't scream. She asked one question that would end up costing him considerably more than any police raid ever could. And the people who owe you those debts, do they know they're trapped, or do you let them think it's love? Kang, for once in 22 years of never being caught without leverage, had absolutely no answer for that. Now, pause here for a second, because this is exactly the kind of question worth sitting with, and honestly, it's the whole rotten engine underneath men like Kang Yeon-woo. He built an empire convincing people that control was kindness, that debt was loyalty, that "I paid for your mother's surgery" and "I love you" could live in the same sentence without anyone noticing the difference. That's not generosity. That's a leash with better PR. So here's the real question, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments, not just scroll past. Have you ever had someone in your life do something for you that was really just a rope with a bow tied on it? Drop it below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of your stories are darker than this script. And if you believe people deserve relationships that aren't built on quiet, invisible debt, hit subscribe, hit like, and stick around for what happens next, because only the Kang Yeon-woos of the world, and the people who make excuses for them, wouldn't. Soo-min left the study that night without slamming the door, which was somehow worse than if she had. Doors slammed in anger get repaired. Doors closed quietly, deliberately, after a conversation like that, those tend to stay shut. She didn't go far, though. 2 streets over, in a modest apartment that smelled faintly of soju and old cigarette smoke, she found the one person in her father's orbit who'd known him longest and, she suspected correctly, resented him most. Han Ji-tae opened his door expecting a courier. He got Kang Yeon-woo's daughter instead, standing on his doorstep with the exact expression of a woman who'd just realized she wasn't the only one collecting evidence. "I need to understand my father," she said, "and I think you're the only person who actually can." Ji-tae looked at her for a long moment, long enough that somewhere, for 1,000 miles and 0 miles away at once, 2 separate clocks kept ticking toward the same 6-day deadline. And then he stepped aside to let her in. Han Ji-tae's apartment was smaller than you'd expect for a man who'd spent a decade being Kang Yeon-woo's most trusted weapon. 1 room, a mattress on the floor, a shelf of paperback thrillers he read to fall asleep, because irony, apparently, is the only free entertainment left for men in his line of work. He made Soo-min tea she didn't drink and sat across from her with the posture of a man deciding, in real time, how much of his life he was willing to hand over to a stranger who happened to share his boss's blood. "Your father," Ji-tae said finally, "taught me that debt is the only honest relationship there is. Money, you can trace. Love, you can't. He prefers things he can trace." "That's the most depressing sentence I've heard all week," Soo-min said. "And I flew business class next to a man who narrated his own divorce for 6 hours." Ji-tae almost smiled. Almost. It had been a while since anyone in Kang's orbit had said anything funny on purpose instead of accidentally, mid-crisis. the way gallows humor sneaks in when nobody's watching. He found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in 10 years, to someone who wasn't already inside the machine and therefore incapable of hearing it from outside. He told her about the courier who disappeared, the shipment routes handed away without explanation, the sentence that still sat in his chest like a swallowed stone, everyone's furniture to somebody. He told her about the scar on his palm and the 4 words that had organized an entire decade of his life around a man who, it turned out, kept receipts on everyone, including the people who bled for him. He didn't build a family, Ji-tae said. He built a spreadsheet with feelings attached, and I was a very productive line item. Soo-min sat with that for a while, turning her cold tea in slow circles. So why haven't you left? Where does a man like me go? I have a record longer than my rap sheet actually shows, thanks to your father's very generous friends in the prosecutor's office. I leave, I've got nothing. I stay, I've got a scar and a title and a boss who thinks loyalty is a renewable resource, like courtesy or courier boys. He looked at her, sharper now. You didn't come here for my life story, though? You came here because you're building a case. Just like the detective. Soo-min went very still. What detective? And there it was, the first thread pulling 2 separate investigations, run by 2 women who'd never met, into the same room. Ji-tae, who made his living noticing things before they became problems, had noticed Oh Se-jin's surveillance patterns months ago the way a man notices a shift in weather before the sky actually changes. He hadn't reported it to Kang. That omission, small and quiet, was the first genuinely disloyal act of his career, and he'd told himself it didn't count because technically, he hadn't done anything. Denial, it turns out, is just betrayal wearing business casual. There's a detective, he said slowly, who's been building something on your father for almost a decade. If half of what I've heard is accurate, she's close. Closer than he thinks. He paused, weighing a decision that had been quietly assembling itself in him for months, maybe years, without his permission. I could make her a lot closer. Why would you do that? Ji-tae held up his scarred palm, turned it so the old white line caught the light. Because I gave him this hand for free, and he's been billing me interest on it for 10 years. I think it's time somebody collected. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Oh Se-jin sat in her unmarked car outside a nondescript office building, watching a warehouse that would, in 5 days, either make or unmake 9 years of her professional life. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. She'd learned the hard way that unknown numbers connected to this case were rarely good news and occasionally arrived with photographs attached. She answered anyway, because that's who she was, the woman who always, eventually, answered. You don't know me, the voice said, low, careful, a man clearly choosing every word like it might be used against him later, which, to be fair, it absolutely would be. But I know exactly how Kang Yeon-woo moves money, who he's paid off inside your own department, and which of your 6-day timelines he's already planning to blow up before you get there. Se-jin's grip tightened on the wheel. 9 years of instinct told her 3 things at once. This was either the break of her entire career, an elaborate trap designed to end it, or, and this was the possibility that made her pulse actually quicken, both, depending entirely on what she did in the next 60 seconds. I'm listening, she said. They met in a place that felt almost insultingly ordinary for the size of the secret changing hands. A 24-hour convenience store on the edge of Busan, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a bored teenager restocking instant noodles like the fate of an entire criminal empire wasn't currently being decided 3 hours over. Han Ji-tae sat with his back to the wall out of a decade of habit. Detective Oh Se-jin sat across from him, coffee untouched, badge left in the car on purpose, because some conversations go better without the reminder of who's supposed to be the enemy. You understand, she said, that everything you're about to tell me could also be a very sophisticated way of feeding me disinformation right before my raid. I do. Ji-tae didn't blink. And you understand that if this is real, I've got maybe 72 hours of being useful to you before I'm either dead or in a cell next to the man I've spent 10 years protecting. Comforting. I wasn't going for comforting. He laid it out with the precision of a man who'd spent a decade thinking in logistics. The false shipment data Kang had planted after the Incheon raid. The name of a mid-level officer in her own department who'd been quietly compensated to leak timelines for the last 6 years. The actual warehouse, not the decoy, not the fish, but the real one, 2 kilometers south, where the pharmaceutical shipment would move the night before her planned raid instead of the night of, specifically to make her entire department look incompetent on the record. Se-jin sat very still, doing the math on 9 years of near misses that suddenly, sickeningly, made sense. Kwon, she said quietly. It's Kwon, isn't it? Ji-tae didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. She should have felt triumphant. Mostly what she felt was tired. The specific exhaustion of finally understanding a puzzle you'd give almost anything to have solved a version of 5 years earlier, before it cost you what it cost you. She didn't say that part out loud. Some grief you don't hand to strangers, even useful ones. Why now, she asked instead. 10 years of loyalty, and you pick this exact week to burn it down. Ji-tae thought about the scar on his palm, about sun, about renewable resource, about a young woman with her father's eyes and none of his patience for excuses, sitting on his one good chair 2 nights ago, asking him a question nobody had bothered asking him in a decade. What do you actually get out of this? Because someone finally asked me a question I couldn't answer with a number, he said, and left it there, because that was as close to honest as Han Ji-tae had been with anyone since he was 19 years old. Kang Yeon-woo, 4 kilometers away, was having a considerably worse evening than either of them, though he didn't know it yet. He was, instead, discovering that his daughter had spent the last 2 nights meeting with his most trusted enforcer, which was the kind of information a man in his position received not through conversation, but through a housekeeper who'd been quietly, terrifyingly loyal to him for 15 years, and who mentioned it with the same tone she'd used to report the koi were due for feeding. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He simply set down his tea, walked to his study, and sat in the dark for a long time, turning over a feeling he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades and therefore didn't immediately recognize. Fear, specifically the fear that belongs only to men who've spent their whole lives being the one holding the leverage and are now, for the first time, uncertain who's holding it on them. He called Ji-tae. No answer. He called Kwon, his officer inside the department, and got a voice that was unmistakably rattled, stammering about some detective sniffing around, asking questions that felt too specific. He called his lawyer. He called a courier. He called, in the end, everyone except the 2 people who actually mattered, because some part of him, the part that had built an empire out of never once admitting weakness, refused to call his own daughter and simply ask her what she'd found. Instead, at 11:40 that night, Kang Yeon-woo did something he hadn't done in 22 years of building walls brick by grateful brick. He picked up the phone and made one final call to move the real shipment 3 days earlier than planned. Tonight, banking on the idea that whatever Ji-tae and his daughter thought they knew, they couldn't possibly move faster than a man who'd spent his whole life staying 1 step ahead of everyone who ever doubted him. He was almost right. Almost has never once, in the history of empires, been good enough. Here's the thing about a man who's spent 22 years being 1 step ahead of everyone. The moment he starts running, he stops being 1 step ahead of himself. Kang Yeon-woo's midnight call to move the shipment 3 days early hit exactly one snag he hadn't accounted for. And it wasn't a detective, and it wasn't a raid. It was traffic. Ordinary, indifferent Busan traffic, a fender bender on the coastal road that delayed his trucks by 41 minutes. 41 minutes that gave Han Ji-tae, who'd been watching the warehouse from a rooftop 2 blocks away with the patience of a man who'd spent a decade learning exactly how his boss thought. Just enough time to call Detective Oh Se-jin and say 4 words that would end an empire. He's moving it now. Se-jin didn't wait for backup protocol, didn't wait for Kwon to coordinate, because Kwon, as of 40 minutes earlier, had been quietly relieved of his phone, his badge, and his ability to warn anyone of anything. She grabbed the 2 officers in her unit she'd trust with her actual life, and they were at the real warehouse, the one 2 kilometers south of the decoy fish crates, the one Kang had never imagined anyone outside his inner circle would find, before the last truck had even finished loading. What followed wasn't cinematic. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase through neon alleys. There was a tired, furious detective standing in a floodlit loading bay at 1 in the morning, holding up a badge to a man in a beige cardigan who'd spent 22 years believing that composure was the same thing as control. Kang Yeon-woo, she said, and her voice, after 9 years, was steadier than she'd expected it to be. I believe we have quite a lot to discuss. He didn't run. Running was for men without leverage, and even now, cuffed, surrounded, caught with more evidence than a courtroom would know what to do with, some deep, stubborn part of him still believed he had leverage somewhere. He looked past her, scanning the officers, the trucks, the wreckage of a plan built over 2 decades, searching for the one face he expected to see orchestrating it all from a safe distance. He found two. Han Ji-tae stood near the warehouse entrance, arms crossed, the scar on his palm catching the floodlights. And beside him, hands in her coat pockets, jaw set exactly like her father's when he was pretending not to feel something, Kang Soo-min. "You built me a fortress," Kang said quietly, to no one in particular, or maybe to both of them at once. "And you tore it down together. You built us a leash," Ji-tae said, "and called it family. I just finally read the fine print." Soo-min didn't say anything at first. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could see, for the first time in years, that she wasn't a stranger with his eyes anymore. She was simply his daughter, standing in the wreckage of everything he'd spent her childhood pretending didn't exist. "You asked me once, when I was 12, why I never wanted anything from you except birthday cards," she said. "I never told you the real answer. I didn't want anything traceable back to you. Turns out I learned that instinct from watching you my whole life. Funny how that works." They took him away without a struggle. The empire that Kang Yeon-woo built out of fish, fear, and meticulous invoicing didn't collapse in fire or gunfire. It collapsed the way most of them eventually do, quietly, in a floodlit parking lot, because two people he'd trained to owe him everything finally decided the debt ran the other way. 9 months later, the trial made headlines across the country. Korea's quiet kingpin. They called him, which he would have hated, since it implied he'd ever been loud about anything. Se-jin testified for 6 hours and slept, for the first time in nearly a decade, without waking at 3 a.m. to check her phone. Ji-tae took a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony that dismantled 3 shell companies and one very compromised officer named Kwon. Soo-min didn't visit her father in prison, not out of cruelty, she'd tell a reporter years later, but because some relationships, once you finally see them clearly, you're allowed to simply close the door on. Quietly, deliberately, and this time for good. The Jigaoki fish market still smells like the ocean having a bad day. Vendors still shout prices at 4 in the morning. And somewhere in that chaos, if you looked closely enough, you might still catch a teenager doing quiet math behind tired eyes, learning, as Kang Yeon-woo once did, that everyone is selling something. The trick, it turns out, isn't collecting debts. It's making sure you never owe the wrong person your whole life to pay one off.